White neighbor called the police to arrest a black maid, and moments later the entire neighborhood was left in shock when the millionaire boss arrived. Sirens sliced through the quiet of a perfect street as a patrol car rolled to a stop in front of a mansion with trimmed hedges and polished stone. A black maid stood on the porch, clutching a key ring and a list of tasks, while across the street the white neighbor folded her arms, phone still warm in her hand. The officers scanned the scene with suspicion, as if order itself required proof from some people more than others. Inside, a vacuum sat mid-aisle, a mop bucket waited, and a clock ticked loud enough to count every breath. The maid knew exactly how she got here. What no one expected was who would arrive next, and what would change because of it. Her days were measured in careful routines. A bus ride before dawn, a thermos of tea, a uniform pressed until it felt like armor. The mansion she cleaned sat high on a hill where lawns looked airbrushed and deliveries glided in like choreography. She had learned the pattern of that house the way a musician learns scales. First floor dusting, second floor linens, kitchen last because sunlight made the counters look like a lake. She took pride in quietly making a place better than she found it. A small mastery in a world that often mistook her skill for simplicity. She had worked there long enough to see seasons change through tall windows, to watch the millionaire boss leave for meetings before the city woke and return long after it slept. They were not friends, not exactly, but a steady trust had formed over years of reliability and respect. Her name appeared on the household schedule beside door codes and delivery windows. The alarm company recognized her entry as authorized. Still, experience taught her to carry proof because the world asked her to prove the same things again and again. Across the street lived a neighbor who treated property lines like moral boundaries. She was new to the block and quick to catalog what belonged and what did not. She noticed the maid but did not truly see her, collecting details the way some collect grievances. A van one day, a different bus stop the next, a uniform that did not match the yard crews. Assumptions settled into place like dust no one bothers to wipe away. So when the maid unlocked the door that morning and rolled a vacuum onto the porch for a moment, the neighbor read the scene like a script she had already written and called the police. The maid heard the siren before she understood it was for her. A reflex she knew too well tightened her shoulders. The same reflex that taught her not to reach abruptly into a bag, not to stand too close to displays in stores, not to look annoyed when asked again for ID. She set the vacuum aside and moved slowly. The officers stepped out with the careful neutrality of people who had been warned and were now measuring a story against a set of training bullet points. She offered her name, the access code, the laminated card with the household's letterhead authorizing entry. Each item landed like a petition. The officers took them, spoke into radios, and scanned windows for contradictions that did not exist. The neighbor hovered at the edge of the driveway, eyes hard with certainty. She described a suspicious figure, a vehicle she did not recognize, a pattern of movement that felt wrong to her. The words carried the authority of a voice that had never been told it did not belong. Inside the mansion, the evidence of ordinary life stood everywhere. A laundry basket waited by the stairs. A shopping list leaned against a fruit bowl. The maid's tote bag held rubber gloves, a stack of microfiber cloths, and a small notebook where she kept a list of rooms and requests. She asked if she could call the household manager. She asked if she could disarm the alarm before it triggered a louder scene. The officers insisted on confirming the story themselves. They were not unkind, but their caution tilted in a familiar direction. Risk in practice was not distributed equally. Minutes stretched into a performance none of the neighbors had paid to see, but many had shown up to watch. Curtains parted. A delivery driver slowed. The maid felt the heat of attention prick her skin, the kind that says a verdict might be decided by the angle at which she stood. She thought of her mother telling her to be impeccable because mistakes cost more for some than for others. She kept her voice even and her hands visible, because safety in moments like this is as much choreography as it is luck. She had done everything right. It did not matter yet. The officers asked the neighbor where she lived and how long she had noticed suspicious activity. The neighbor recited observations like claims to a prize. The maid wondered how a life could be reduced to footnotes in a stranger's story. She thought about every time she had arrived early and waved to a different neighbor who waved back. Every time she had accepted packages to keep them safe. Every time she had made small repairs because pride insists on leaving places better than you found them. None of that had made her undeniable. One officer finally called the number posted on the household board. It rang to voicemail. They called the security company and waited for a response. Waiting turned the air into something heavy. The neighbor folded her arms tighter, confident enough to speak to others on the sidewalk without lowering her voice. Words like break-in and trespass floated louder than the morning birds. The maid stood in her uniform on the porch of the house she kept immaculate, cataloging every second she could not get back. Then a text buzzed on one officer's phone, a confirmation from the security company that the entry code matched the maid's authorization. A second later, an alert flashed that the homeowner had been notified. The officer's posture softened by a degree hardly noticeable to those who have never needed to notice such degrees. The neighbor's certainty faltered just enough to make room for irritation. The maid's relief did not arrive. She knew the script was not finished. A black sedan cleared the hill and rolled to a stop so smoothly it seemed to float. The millionaire stepped out, jacket tossed over one shoulder, face carved with the kind of calm that comes from knowing 1,000 details answer to you. He took in the scene without drama. The officers, the neighbor, the vacuum on the porch, the maid holding steady because steady is what keeps you whole. The neighbor straightened, prepared to accept thanks for her vigilance. The maid braced for another round of translation she had already provided. What happened next shifted the weight of the morning. The millionaire walked to the maid first. Not to the officers, not to the neighbor. He looked at the key ring still looped on her finger and the list of tasks dog-eared in her palm. Relief, respect, and anger, measured, directed, not theatrical, crossed his face. Years of quiet competence stood between them like an unbreakable bridge. Only then did he turn to the officers, offering the confirmation they already had, requesting that the incident report reflect exactly what occurred. A lawful employee present with authorization, a call grounded not in evidence, but in assumption. The neighbor tried to steer the narrative back toward safety concerns and unusual movement. Her voice carried the practiced tone of someone accustomed to being credited with care rather than implicated in harm. The millionaire listened, then pointed, gently but unmistakably, to the pattern underneath. A black woman in a uniform deemed suspicious by proximity to wealth, a neighbor unfamiliar with the rhythms of a household, deciding that unfamiliarity equals threat, a call that transformed honest work into a spectacle of suspicion. The officers, to their credit, recorded details as requested, de-escalated with professionalism, and left. The neighbor's certainty thinned into embarrassment, then into a brittle defensiveness that cracked at the edges. The maid, who had done nothing but her job, stood in the wreckage of everyone else's story. The millionaire opened the front door, gestured for her to step inside first, and followed. A vacuum hummed again in a house that needed ordinary noise to push the morning out. In the quiet that followed, a decision formed that would not stop at apologies. Change did not come with a press conference. It started with policy. The millionaire convened the household team and wrote what should have been obvious into procedures. A contact tree with multiple numbers that would always reach someone. An exterior sign visible from the street, indicating authorized service hours. A neighborhood memo introducing staff by role and a simple note about calling the homeowner before calling the police. Nothing about safety was diminished. Everything about dignity was fortified. He met with the neighborhood association and offered more than a reprimand. He offered a mirror. He talked about patterns masked as prudence, about how risk assessments get distorted by race, about how a street's beauty means very little if it is built on suspicion that tracks certain bodies like a shadow. Some neighbors resisted, framing bias as a personal insult rather than a correctable habit. Enough listened. A pilot program emerged, implicit bias training attached to the neighborhood watch. A hotline routed to homeowners first. A quarterly gathering that centered the people who actually maintained the neighborhood. Gardeners, cleaners, delivery drivers, nannies, whose names were finally said into microphones instead of whispered in doorways. Inside the mansion, the maid returned to her routines without shrinking. The millionaire adjusted compensation, created a paid emergency time policy for all household staff, and extended similar standards across his companies. He instructed corporate security to review protocols with the same question at the center. Who is most likely to be mistaken for a threat while simply doing their job, and what are we changing so that stops? Reports that once measured only losses began to measure harms avoided. The neighbor eventually crossed the street. An apology stumbled out, burdened by the need to explain intention. The maid accepted what was hers to accept and refused what was not. Accountability, she knew, is not the same as absolution. Over time, awkwardness softened into a cautious civility anchored by clearer boundaries. A holiday card arrived months later with a handwritten note that did not erase the morning but acknowledged it. It was not closure. It was movement. The maid's bus ride home felt different on certain days. She looked up from her book and saw a corner of the city where a policy, a sign, a conversation had shifted because she refused to disappear inside someone else's mistake. She had not asked to be a symbol. She asked to be allowed to work in peace. The morning the Sirens came taught a simple lesson with complicated roots. Safety without equity is not safety. It is hierarchy with a badge. If a single call can turn honest work into suspicion, a single decision can turn a neighborhood into a community. The next time a story begins to write itself in your head about who belongs, will you call the police, or will you call your assumptions by their name and choose a different ending?